Yo guys, welcome back to another video. Today I'm a little late to this kind of video, but we're going to be looking back at the year 2024, taking a look at the books that I read, and we're going to be ranking them from what I think is subjectively the worst to the best, or not necessarily worst to best, but the ones I liked the least to the ones I liked the most, and my favorite reads of last year. You know, this is piggybacking off of my last video where I talk about what we're doing moving forward in the year 2025. I wasn't going to address much of the last year in that video, but I guess it just kind of came anyway because it was sort of a rambly stream of consciousness kind of video. So I ended up addressing a lot of the issues I had last year in that video anyway. So I'm not going to rehash a lot, but one thing to note is that last year wasn't a great year for reading for me. I did read some awesome books in the first half of the year, but in the second half of the year, between moving and just reading burnout and poor mental health, I just didn't get a lot of reading done at all, at least for novels, in the latter half of the year. So you know, I did plan on reading quite a bit last year, and I started off strong, but yeah, after like the summer, things just went kind of downhill until there was months where I didn't read anything. So that kind of explains why there isn't a lot, also why I wasn't uploading as much after a certain point. But regardless, that's about it for the intro. I mean, that's really all there is to it. So without further ado, let's get into it. So coming in at number 10, the book also, before I start, I should mention, there are some things on here that aren't specific books. There are, like, one of the places on here is actually 3 books, but they're really short and kind of tell a cohesive story, so I made it just one spot. There's another spot on this list that is a novella, as well as the first novel of the series, so together, in my head, it was kind of one spot because they were very similar and take place in the same series. So there are some things that are kind of, you know, aren't exactly specific books for a placement, if that makes sense. Anyway, it's my list, whatever. So coming in at number 10, the thing that I like the least, I don't actually have it on me. I think it's probably packed in a box somewhere. But my least favorite book that I read last year, not trying to throw much shade or anything, just the thing I rated the worst and probably enjoyed the least, was Final Assembly by Dennis Myers. This is a I think it's self-pub. If not self-pub, then indie. I don't think it's self-pub, but it's an indie sci-fi novel that's sort of a dystopian murder mystery, at least in the first book. And later on goes into sort of there's like some elements of cyberpunk in it, which was kind of cool, with like corporations and corporate control, but a lot of it, there's like space travel, and there are some cool elements to it. I just didn't love it. I thought that the dialogue needed some work in this first novel. Just wasn't a fan. I kind of had to push through to read it. A lot of the character decisions were poor. If you see me looking off to the side or moving my hand, I have my computer open so I could see the list and all that, and looking at my Goodreads. Yeah, just overall, wasn't the biggest fan. And because it was an indie novel and I had talked to the author and stuff, I wasn't gonna lie about my review and lie about my enjoyment of it and give it a glowing review when I didn't like it. So I gave an honest review, but I definitely tried to soften the punches a little bit and be nice about it. Yeah, there was just a lot about it that I disliked in the way that it was written. Yeah, nothing against the author personally. I just really had to push through to read it, and it seemed very amateur. I believe it's his first novel, so it makes sense. Yeah. I just didn't really care for it. Coming in at number 9, another book that I do not have on me currently, and I believe it's downstairs because I'm lending it out or if not downstairs, then in my parents' room because I'm lending it to my father to read. And that would be Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. So Dark Matter was actually pretty sick. I read this as sort of a palate cleanser, and I had picked up the book on a whim because I thought it sounded really interesting. And I'm not a big thriller kind of guy, I'd say. I don't typically read books that are taking place in our real world. I'm a very sci-fi fantasy guy, and the kind of sci-fi that I like is usually space opera or stuff of the sort, unrealistic science fiction. But this is a very grounded, realistic sci-fi story that's almost like It's a Wonderful Life to me. That's what it reminded me of a lot, and that's sort of why I picked it up, because I love the movie It's a Wonderful Life, one of the best Christmas movies, and just a really great movie in general, just the story that it tells. And that's what it reminded me of a lot, except it's got this like sci-fi thriller twist to it, and man, I was on the edge of my seat when I read it. I'm really happy that I did pick it up, even if it was on a whim, and decided to read it on a whim. Yeah, I finished it really quick. It was just really fun, but it's not one that I think about super often, and because it is such outside my normal reads, and there were some things that I was already pretty invested in later on this list that, you know, some things already had that ended up having a little bit more of a emotional impact because they're a part of a series that I already like. This was like a standalone novel, so I mean, it makes sense. I don't really think standalone novels are gonna place super high for me all the time. Maybe if one like really stands out, but it's gotta be special to really get a standalone novel. Has got to be really special to get much higher on a list for me, just because series are, you know, establishing characters that you have emotional connection to over multiple books, and just have a lot more time to develop, so that's why they end up being better and more enjoyable to me personally. But yeah, Dark Matter was awesome. Really great read. I highly recommend it. I have not watched the show that they ended up doing, but the book was great, and I do really need to get around to checking out a couple other Blake Crouch books, like Upgrade and Recursion. Those are the two other ones that were on my radar that I wanted to read as well. Now, coming in at number 8 is one that I do have on me, and that is A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving. This is not the copy that I read from. This is actually one that I went and bought on my own after the fact, like later on, just because I actually enjoyed it. I had to read it for school, so it's a bit of an odd book for my typical reading. We had to read that in school. I would not have chosen it otherwise, not by a long shot, but it ended up being a really interesting book that handled, you know, themes of faith and destiny and fate, but it did it in an interesting way with an interesting time period and backdrop. It takes place, it starts in like the 50s in America, in the Northeast, and it's sort of a story that goes through the Vietnam War era into the 80s, and you follow this character who is talking about a childhood best friend of his, and, you know, they're basically both of their lives from when they were kids to adults, and you follow their misadventures and all of the shit that they've got going on pretty much their whole lives. And there's an element of tragedy to it. It's also really funny and like crude in parts. It's really enjoyable. It's a long novel. I don't know how long this copy is, this large copy ends up being like 530 pages. The mass market that I read for school was more like 800, I think. Was it 800, 700? Something like that. So it's not a short novel, and I actually started it back in 2023 in the fall and read it, I want to say through the spring, pretty much the early spring, just because we would read some and then like take a break to answer questions about it. I mean, it was for school, right? We were quizzed and tested on portions of the book. But yeah, everybody in my class kind of hated this book for the most part, I feel like. I mean, if anything, they thought it was okay, but I actually was pretty invested in the story throughout the entire time we were analyzing it. So, yeah, if you're looking for some, I guess it's partly historical fiction, because it does deal heavily with America. I guess important events like in the it talks about important political figures throughout the years, and then talks about the Vietnam War later on. That's one of the biggest aspects, as well as pop culture references throughout. So if you're at all interested in that, there's also like a mystery throughout, because you know the whole time the main character is trying to figure out who its father is, and that's a whole nother thing. So it's a very deep story that I don't remember what I ended up rating it. I guess that's something I should be looking at here, but in fact I can hover over the book on Goodreads here. I gave it 4 stars, which I guess maybe adds up. I would honestly probably change that and give it a 5 stars, because it is really a fantastic book. And yeah, going back, the first book that I read, which was Final Assembly, I did give 2 stars, and then Dark Matter I also gave 4 stars. All right, so moving on, we are at number 7, and that is going to be Iron Gold by Pierce Brown. This is book 4 of the Red Rising series, and as you can see, I've got this awesome cover. I ended up upgrading my covers for Red Rising to these, what is it, Nerdy Ink covers. So I have all these, and you'll, trust me, there's some Red Rising on this list, because, I mean, sci-fi in general kind of dominated my reading last year, but I did a lot of the Red Rising, so you'll see a lot of it on this list. But Iron Gold, I think, is probably the worst book in the series. It was still enjoyable. I mean, it placed number 7, and having already read the first 3 books and then being established with this world and these characters does help. But I think looking back, I can understand how it's sort of a difficult book to write, coming off of how the first arc, I would consider it. Pierce Brown, I've seen in interviews, doesn't like when people say, you know, the first part of Red Rising and the second part. I mean, I understand that it's one cohesive story, and people don't always treat it as such, but at the very least, I would consider them arcs. So coming off of the first arc, being the first 3 books, I understand how a continuation can be kind of different, or difficult, I mean, because it's about tearing down an empire, and moving forward, it's about reestablishing democracy and rebuilding a world, pretty much, and fighting to keep it. And it's kind of, where do you go, you know? So this book, I thought, was rocky for lots of portions. You go from, you know, just reading Darrow for the whole first 3 books, him telling you what's happening, and it being very interesting and, I don't know, very visceral and like a punch in the gut, like every time. Like, it seems so action-packed and high octane, as you're reading this story of, you know, love and betrayal and rebellion, you know. And this, moving forward, the series, at least in this book, kind of takes a step back, because in a lot of ways this one is setting up a lot. I would say even more so than the first book in the series, Red Rising. I'd say from the get-go, it's pretty fast-paced and is setting things up steadily. But this one's having to, like, I don't know. I'm kind of struggling to explain what's up here, but it's slower. And the conflict, you're being introduced to these new characters, and when you already have characters that were established, those are like the best parts. But now you're stepping into the shoes of other characters that you've never met. So in a lot of ways, it's just a huge adjustment, and that works against it, I think, coming off of how good the ending of the first arc was. And, you know, it's just a different tone. It's tonally different, and there's just so much new that you need to adjust to that it's just all working against Iron Gold. Not to say that it's a bad book, because there were some awesome moments and awesome character developments. The plot was still good, but compared to the other books in the series, and just the rocky sort of start, I think it is the worst in the series. It took me a while to get there, but I got there, you know, trying to get my thoughts together here. Anywho, moving on. It says I gave it 5 stars, but I think it ended up actually being more like 4.5. Looking back, I don't know why I gave it 5 stars. Yeah, I gave it a 4.5, but honestly, it's probably more like a 4, like looking back, but it's all good. So where are we on the list? All right, so at number 6, I have one that might be a shock to some people, might not be, and that is going to be Sun Eater. So last year I read Empire of Silence here, as well as The Lesser Devil, and so I'm kind of wrapping the two together, just because, like I said at the very beginning, The Lesser Devil is a novella that kind of piggybacks off the events in this first book, at the beginning at least. So I feel like they kind of go hand in hand, and one wasn't much more spectacular than the other. I rated them both similarly. So I figured and since they were the only ones that I read in the series last year, I could just smash them together, and rate them both as just Sun Eater. Yeah, so where do I start? So I had been interested in Sun Eater for a long time. I just never picked it up, and it being out of print for a long time didn't help either. But then the paperbacks came out, and that's how I read it originally. I don't have the paperbacks anymore. I ended up giving my few copies I had to my uncle to read, and I upgraded to the hardcovers when those came back in print. So, I mean, hearing as, you know, I'd been interested in it for a while, but then it just kind of blew up, and which was really awesome to see as an outsider. Series that, you know, isn't super popular, but you've been interested in for a minute, just absolutely blow up out of nowhere. And it wasn't really out of nowhere. I feel like it was a long time coming, but yeah, just the hype surrounding Sun Eater was astounding. So when I finally got around to reading Empire of Silence, I really liked the beginning portion of it, but the middle to end just really dragged. You know, I really liked the story. It was tonally pretty dark and cold, which, you know, reading Sun Eater, at least in this Empire of Silence, was a vibe, honestly. Like, just whenever I think about Sun Eater in my mind, I just think of it being gloomy and it raining and being cold, and just dark, and brooding, because that's how Hadrian Marlowe tells the story. It's very poetic too, and so I wouldn't say it's a very easy book to read. It takes a lot of brain power to read this, just because There are some moments in it that are pretty philosophical, which I enjoy. It's just a higher level read. However, I think the plot in the second half really dragged. I liked the first half when, you know, he's back home and then he has to, what's the word, where he gets exiled pretty much and ends up on the planet. My favorite portion of the book, honestly, and it's the part that I've heard most people dislike, or was the part of the book that was unnecessary or something like that, is the part where he's living on the streets of this kind of forgotten planet that's kind of dilapidated and junky planet kind of deal, where he has his little girlfriend, but the problem is that she's like a plebeian pretty much, and there's like this disease going rampant, and so because he's basically a god amongst men, just because of his genetic breeding, like his genetic stock pretty much, he's able to live for hundreds and hundreds, even 1,000 years, while these normal people die off, you know. And that's always an element of stories that I thought is interesting, an element of Invincible. If you've read the comic or watched the show, that's an idea that's presented there, you know, the what will you have in 500 years, you know, if you know the meme. But it's like a really interesting concept. You know, this is, I don't know how much it's explored, but I would assume it is in like in Superman, right? You know, these godlike beings that being attached to mere humans who will die. You know, they might live 80 years, but to a god, that's like a second, right? Because just proportionally speaking, they live for so much longer. That's sort of what happens. And it was just very emotionally touching in that beginning part. And I really liked what was happening there, and the mystery of how he ended up getting there in the first place and what happened, him sneaking around. And even the parts where he was a gladiator, I think, were pretty cool. At least the initial idea, because, I mean, spoiler alert, the little girl, I say little girl, but his little girlfriend dies. And so he feels like he doesn't have anything more to offer to the world. He's, you know, like a forgotten, exiled prince, pretty much. So he ends up becoming a gladiator, which was pretty cool. I liked that part for the most part. The part where it started to get kind of to me and boring and dragging is the whole section where he's at the palace with the Duke and all of that. I mean, I thought when he met Volca, I think Volca is pretty sick, and, you know, when they're talking to the Cielson, I believe they're called, and they're studying them and all these weird alien things. I mean, I thought it was interesting, but the parts where, you know, that whole section where he's in this palace and just kind of sitting around, I did not care for. So what I'm really hoping is that the story picks up in Howling Dark, which I do plan on reading this year, and I've heard it does. I want more of the action, and yeah, I mean, I understand that, you know, this is kind of a world building book, but it was just a little disappointing. I think I ended up giving it 4 stars. Yeah, 4 stars, 4.5, something like that. Yeah, anyway, that's Empire of Silence. Also, it's a pretty long book, but The Lesser Devil, on the other hand, was really sick. I enjoyed The Lesser Devil a lot, and a lot of the parts I liked about The Lesser Devil were lightly touched on in Empire of Silence, and I'm sure it'll be touched on later on too. But a lot of it is because of what I like is how religion is handled in the far future and in far future stories. You see this a lot. For example, I mean, it's in Red Rising, but also, you know, I think one of the most famous examples is Warhammer. Just the absolute secular truth, just how the collapse of religion, pretty much, and believing in absolute science, you know, the secular imperial truth, you know, as they say in Warhammer. But looking back at, but how they examine religion and look back to it, you know, we see it as such a prominent thing in modern society. I mean, religion is still huge, and just seeing it referenced as somewhat of a footnote, and just like references to, like, I think it was either in in The Lesser Devil or in Empire of Silence, they talk about Jesus Christ and they reference him as the Magus of old, almost like an ancient wizard kind of. And I don't know, I think it's really interesting how that sort of stuff is handled in science fiction. I don't always necessarily agree with it as a Christian myself, but it's still very fascinating to me. But The Lesser Devil, that plays a lot with religion, because the whole plot is that Crispin, who, I mean, he's kind of a dick. In the first book, we come to learn more why in this book, and he becomes more fleshed out and more of a likable character. But he ends up on this planet where, well, he's on the same planet, but in this area that has a sort of forgotten tribe of French Catholics. But yeah, anyway, The Lesser Devil is very much, there's some thriller sort of aspects on it, some edge of your seat moments. And the action sequences and the fights are pretty sick. The characters are dope. The plot sort of revolves around royal treachery, I suppose. So it's a very interesting read, and because of its length, because of its short length, I do think it has its weaknesses, but it also has a lot of strengths. While if you take a look at Empire of Silence, you know, there's a lot of things I think that it was lacking, but it was also super long. So I think it's kind of a yin and yang kind of deal. Empire of Silence and Lesser Devil sort of complete each other, if that makes sense. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it feels that in a lot of ways what Empire of Silence is lacking is present in The Lesser Devil, and vice versa. So that's also part of the reason why I sort of wrapped them in together, because together it's still a great story, but on their own there are some things that are lacking. Now I'm gonna be honest, for this next place, number 5, I have something written down, but I don't know that I necessarily agree with it, honestly. I'm having trouble here. Alright, so at number 5, the thing I'm going to go with, but honestly, number 4 and number 5 are kind of a toss-up to me. It could go either way, but I suppose it doesn't matter much. I'll just go with what I have written down. And that is going to be Morning Star by Pierce Brown. This is book 3 of Red Rising. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed this book. It's one of the best Red Rising books. Looking back, again, it could very well be number 4 on this list. And I'll explain why. The number 4 is another Red Rising book, so I don't know. But anyway, it's one of the best books. It's the finale of that first arc. There's a lot that this book does well. It's a very good book. I mean, I think that the pacing is a little different in this one than previous Red Rising books. I think in both the Golden Sun and the first one, it's pretty breakneck. It's just completely action-packed, but this third book is the first one that I feel like really takes a step back and contemplates things, if that makes sense. It's more of a, how do I say, I don't know, it's more of a contemplative book than both Red Rising and Golden Sun, because, I mean, this is the end. This is where everything is everything has been revealed, for the most part. I mean, and to the characters in the world. It's about the rebellion is in the works. Everybody's in the mix now. It's about tearing shit down, and we finally wrap this up, kind of deal, but there is some parts, like I said, that are just a bit slower and contemplative and introspective that I think that Golden Sun and Red Rising don't have, which makes it, in essence, a little slower, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't really know what else to say about Morningstar, just because, I mean, I enjoyed it a lot. I think the ending was crazy. I think that little plot twist at the end with Cassius, probably I should have seen coming, but I didn't. So when, like, the whole thing happens where Darrow gets captured, for some reason I didn't see that coming. So when everything kind of got revealed, I guess it was a lot better than it would have been. I hear that a lot of people don't like that part because they were like, well, no, duh, that was all part of a plan. But I don't know, I didn't see it coming. So I mean, I liked it a lot. Yeah, I mean, and it leaves a lot open to interpretation that, I mean, where if you read the first 3 books, it kind of ties it up, and you can think about it and be like, well, where did they go from here, kind of thing. And it gets answered, later on, obviously, in the subsequent novels. But, I mean, it's great just because you can read those first 3 books as its own story. Yeah, I don't know. I just really enjoyed the book. And everything that happens is pretty freaking sick. Alright, so coming in at number 4, this is the one that I was having trouble with. I put Dark Age at number 4 with Morningstar at number 5. And I don't necessarily know that I agree with that. But there's just more content here. I mean, Morningstar is a shorter book, and Dark Age is a long book. It also, see, now that I'm saying it, honestly, Morningstar should be number 4 and Dark Age number 5, but whatever. Dark Age nearly killed my motivation for reading, I will say, now that I'm remembering. It took me a long while to get through it, and I think that's part of the reason why I needed to read Dark Matter, just because I couldn't keep going, because Dark Age, I thought parts of it were kind of annoying. That whole section of the novel where Darrow was being besieged, I believe, on like that desert area, and then with what's his name, the Alun boy, I forget his name, it's been too long since I've read Red Rising, but when he is like with the Fear Knight and all of that, and he gets kind of captured but has to keep his identity secret, like that whole section I thought was kind of whack, and just his it was boring in his dealings. I know you're just Pierce Brown's having to set up everything from a different perspective too, other than Darrow's, but I just don't care about the Loon's point of view as much as Darrow. Like I'm here for Darrow for the most part. It just wasn't as interesting, and I feel like in a lot of ways this book focuses a lot on the other point of view. What I did like in this book is, I believe it's in this one that we get all of the rebellion on the moon, on Luna, because I believe on Luna is where like the council is and all that, and the Republic, and the Day of Red Doves or whatever it's called. Again, it's been a while, That was insane. When everything that happened there went down, bruh. Yeah, that was crazy. I really enjoyed that. It was very much, I mean, Golden Sun, I think, had sort of a Red Wedding kind of moment, which is part of the reason why I love it, because I love Game of Thrones, and the Red Wedding is insane, and Golden Sun managed to pull it off at the end of the book, and I think it was executed in a similar way to Game of Thrones. And it was similar, but I think we see it not necessarily resolved, but how it's handled throughout the rest of the book, as opposed to it being left on a cliffhanger like it did in A Storm of Swords. So, I mean, there is like a Red Wedding kind of deal, and it being called like the Day of Red Doves. I mean, you know, but yeah, that part was dope. I think Ephraim, he was a character that was severely lacking in Iron Gold, but he became far more interesting and a better character, and ended up being one of my favorite Red Rising characters in this book. And on that front, all of the stuff with the, what are they, I forget what they're called now, but the Viking, not aliens, but the Obsidians, I thought was interesting, I guess. I feel like in this book, there's just too much going on. And I don't often say that, but I think it's true. With this, I don't know. I feel like a lot of it was kind of boring and slogged. And that's kind of why it killed my motivation. There were some awesome moments. And I think it improved on Iron Gold. It was just long, and I can see how a lot of it was necessary, but it was just long and kind of and in large portions, which is why I definitely think Morning Star should be above this. I should not have rated it the way that I did. So yeah, I mean, it's a good book, but yeah, it takes a while to get through. All right, so coming in at number 3, this is actually 3 novels, but I kind of wrapped it into one. These were the last novels that I read in 2024, and it kind of changed the way that I look at reading a little bit, and I'll explain why, I guess, I don't know, but that is the Horus Heresy for Warhammer. I got into Warhammer over the summer, and I talked a little bit about that, and I started reading these Horus Heresy novels, and man, these are fantastic. I think I gave them all 5 stars. I think maybe book 2 I gave 4, 4.5, something like that, but books 1 and 3 are 5-star reads, absolutely, and I'm almost finished with the 4th novel right now, and the Horus Heresy is just fantastic. These first 3 novels tell one cohesive story about the corruption of the Luna Wolves and the Sons of Horus, but the character work in these is fantastic. And you know, I think that, I guess, media tie-in novels I never really gave a fair chance, because there are a lot of really shitty ones out there, but these are amazing, actually. I think that they're short, and in a lot of ways can be very blunt in the way that it's told, but also some of it's like very vivid and poetic and purpley, as far as the prose. So it's like the perfect, and they're all written by different authors too, for the most part. I mean, there are some recurring authors, but in these first 3 books, it's 3 different authors. And if I didn't know any better, I'd say it was the same guy, or woman, but considering it's Warhammer, I mean, it would probably be a dude. Anyway, my point is that for it being different people writing it, it's blended very well, and I think it's just a really great mix of purple and just blunt prose. yeah, I don't know, just the way that they're written is fantastic. The plot is great. The character work is superb. My boy Garviel Loken, that is my boy. That is my homie, bro. Also, the homie Carcasey. Yo! When I first started these books, I didn't really give a rat's ass about the Remembrancer characters. I really only was here for the Astartes, the Space Marines. I feel like that's why we're all here. And I mean, to be fair, I'm still really here for the Astartes and Space Marine shit. That's dope. But throughout these books, it really opened my eyes to the Remembrancers. I thought they were super sick. And there were ones that were like, you know, I had Olatin and Keeler I thought were okay. Keeler ends up becoming badass, by the way. But my favorite, hands down, was Ignis Carcasey. He was so cool, snarky, and sarcastic, but just his relationship. And also, the part that I like, not just them on their own, but the way that they interact with the Astartes, I think is really great. The relationship between Garviel and Carcasey is one of my favorite character dynamics. Also, a little bit his relationship with Olatin, and just how they interact with each other. I mean, I like it a lot, and it's definitely one of the most tragic stories I've ever read, because the first book does well to establish how tight-knit this group is and how strong of a brotherhood they have here. And, you know, the legions of the Astartes and the emperors and the primarchs, like, them betraying each other is just not even, it's incomprehensible. Like, how could they do that? Because they're basically programmed to be loyal to each other, loyal to their primarchs, and above all, loyal to the Emperor of Mankind. But just seeing the corruption, where it starts, and just the slow spread of corruption like a cancer throughout the legions. And, you know, it starts with the, well, technically it starts with the word bearers, but the first time we see it really spread is through the Sons of Horus, and then, you know, the rest is history. But just this tragic downfall of the Legiones Astartes, right? So, I don't know. It's just a very interesting read. The character work is great. The way that they're written is fantastic. And it was some of my most surprising reads of last year. And I am pretty deep into Warhammer right now. I'm loving it. And these first 3 books were just superb. Coming in at number 2, if I can find it, was one of my favorite books I think that I have ever read, and that is going to have to be Lightbringer by Pierce Brown. This is book 6 of Red Rising. Man, what a turnaround, right? From books 4 and 5. Yeah, I mean, I was scared because I absolutely loved the first 3 books. Red Rising, when I first read it, I liked it a lot, but then I was skeptical about it still. Golden Sun's one of my favorite books of all time. Morning Star is fantastic. But, you know, Iron Gold let me down. I enjoyed it, but it let me down. Similarly with Dark Age, it nearly killed my motivation to read at the time, just because of how long it was and how sloggy it was. It was an important book. I enjoyed most of it, but in a lot of ways, it also let me down. Lightbringer, however, yo, this was so much a return to form to the first 3 books. I think the return of Cassius and just the Brotherhood coming back together, you know, Darrow and Cassius and, God bless America, I can't remember his name, but literally my favorite character, Severo. Why can't I remember Severo's name? Yeah, it's just been way too long since I've read these. Just the return of that brotherhood, though, I think made this book. It had very much the parts of Iron Gold that I liked were sort of space western sort of vibes especially at the beginning of the book, where Cassius and not Severo, but I can't ever remember the loon's name. Anyway, when him and Cassius are on the ship together with the one chick who's like their pilot, it's very much like a Firefly or Guardians of the Galaxy, Cowboy Bebop, you know, space opera, space western sort of vibe, and I absolutely love that aesthetic. But then this book goes back to that and does it with characters that I actually care about and like, so it ends up being just an awesome character dynamic kind of story of this motley crew that's put together. You know, their democracy, their whole way of life is on the verge of collapse after being taken over and fought back against the Empire, which they fought so hard years ago to destroy, is finally back. And they're on the verge of the galaxy just coasting, right? Their whole system is failing. And they've got to bring it back. You know, they got to go on some missions together, do some secret stuff, blow some stuff up, kill some people, and we got to fix what's going on. And just how they work together and the character dynamics and the Lyria and Cassius together are just amazing. And Severo and Darrow and Cassius reuniting and, you know, putting to bed old differences and all that. It's just such a wonderful book. The action is fantastic. Just how everything comes together, and it has me so excited for Red God. And there's a part in this book in particular that was just, as I read it, just absolutely heartbreaking. And spoiler alert if you haven't read it, but Darrow finally gets to go back to Mustang, or what's her name, Virginia Mustang, whatever. And he's talking to her, and they're on their way to the planet, and she calls him pretty much. They're finally in range, and she's like, yo, I know we've been trying to get back to each other for so long, but you can't come back yet. You need to turn your ass around and do one last mission. And, you know, the whole, you know, books 4 and I think 5 especially is just a very much a book of longing. And, or at least, for everybody, really, but for Darrow especially, I feel like, just a book of longing. And, yeah, it was just a very emotional scene where, you know, he's been waiting all this time. I don't know how much time has passed between books 4 and 5, but obviously, you know, in book 4, he had to run. He was on the run for killing that dude. And, you know, he was scared that Virginia thought that he would ruin all of her plans and betray everything that they built together. And now that they're finally able to talk to each other, and, you know, he's on the verge of being able to see her and hold her again, she tells him over the comms, you know, don't come back. You got one more mission. Like, oh, like that hurt reading it, you know. Yeah, it's just such a fantastic story. I love what Pierce Brown has done. And even though there are parts of Red Rising that I'm not as big of a fan of, don't get it twisted. I mean, Red Rising is easily one of my favorite series of all time, start to finish. Parts that I don't like, I understand a lot of it's necessary. I think maybe it could have been executed better, but who cares? I mean, when book 6 comes around, you know, I don't know, it just hit different. It's hard to explain, but yeah, I was just so very invested in coming off of book 5, which was a slog, and this one, it's a long book, but it was action-packed. It was super sick, so I absolutely love it. It's my second favorite, maybe even my favorite. I go back and forth sometimes, but I think, like, I've solidified Golden Sun as, like, my favorite Red Rising book. if Golden Sun's my number 1, then this is easily my number 2. So if you're reading Red Rising and you're feeling iffy about it once you've gotten into books 4 and 5 and you're thinking about dropping it, please don't. At least read Lightbringer. If you don't like Lightbringer, then maybe drop it. If you're not, but I mean, at that point, you're already that deep into the series. Like, there's like 2 books left. Like, but anyway, yeah, no, Lightbringer is worth the wait. It's such a fantastic novel, and I am so excited for Red God. That's probably, I'm hesitant to say it, but probably my most anticipated read ever. Is Red God, because it's finally a series that I'm actually caught up with. Because, you know, stuff like Stormlight, I was excited for Wind and Truth, but I wasn't anywhere near being caught up, really. Same with Sun Eater. Like, I'm excited for the finale of Sun Eater, but I haven't even read book 2 yet, you know what I mean? But with Red Rising, yeah, I'm 6 books deep, and the finale is on its way, you know what I mean? So, yeah, I'm just so excited for Red God. Red Rising is literally the tits. It's freaking fantastic if you haven't read it. So coming in at number 1 is Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. This is book 2 of the Stormlight Archive. This is probably my favorite book that I have ever read in my life. Granted, I haven't read like a whole ton, but I've read a numerous amount of novels, and I can say that this one's probably my favorite. I liked The Way of Kings a lot. There were parts of it that were slow, but I think that overall it was excellent. And funny enough, Way of Kings was my favorite book of 2023. I read it at the very end. It was one of the last books I read in 2023, and it ended up being my favorite. Words of Radiance I read at the beginning of 2024, and also ends up being my favorite. I went back and forth between Way of Kings and Words of Radiance for a long time. I think a lot of it was because a lot of people love Words of Radiance. It's the highest rated Stormlight book out of all of them. It's one of the highest rated books in general, like on Goodreads. And maybe I wanted to be a little bit different and be like, actually, Way of Kings is my favorite. Which isn't something I hear people say often. But I think over time I really thought about it, and I was like, yeah, Way of Kings is good. Words of Radiance literally improves on just about everything. And it's like the perfect fantasy novel. If you told the most advanced AI ever, right, to write the perfect fantasy novel, it would spit out Words of Radiance, because it is. For as long as it is very fast paced, I feel like, and it's not even really that fast paced. Like, I don't know, there's just so much going on that, and it's written damn near perfect. Like, there are maybe a few sections that feel a little sloggy, but for the most part, the pacing, and for a Stormlight book, I think the pacing is usually pretty slow, and it's large, which makes them typically hard to get through. But Words of Radiance, though, I zoomed through this because there was just so much interesting shit happening, so many cool reveals. The character work is fantastic. I didn't think really any of the characters in this were uninteresting. I think that in The Way of Kings, a lot of the characters were interesting, the points of view, but the Shallan points of view really brought it down for me, and I still think Way of Kings is awesome. One of my favorite books, but just Shallan's parts in that first book were kind of like, ugh. But in this, Sanderson found a way to make Shallan cool, and, you know, the reveal when she whips out the shard blade for the first time out of nowhere, I'm like, what? Like, blew my mind, right? Sanderson made Shallan cool, which I didn't think would be possible, but he did it. And she maintains being cool throughout this entire book. And then I think in Oathbringer, I won't talk about it much because I still have to do my review on that at some point, like as soon as I finish it. But oh my god, Shallan, it goes back. She's better than Book 1 Shallan, but not as good as Words of Radiant Shallan. It's kind of disappointing. But yeah, my favorite section, I would say, of this book is when Kaladin breaks his leg, or wounds his leg or something, or the Chasm Fiend like bites it, or I can't remember exactly what happens. But his leg is wounded, and he, throughout the second book, he's sort of losing himself. He ends up losing his bond with Syl and almost kills her by accident, because he's just dealing with his mental health, which is something that resonates with me personally. But just him losing himself, and then there's that scene where he's at the dueling grounds in the rain, and he's doing like his familiar stances or whatever, and he fails like miserably, and he can't do it. And it's at that point that he realizes that, you know, these things that have been drilled into his mind, you know, and it's so familiar to him, but he can't. There's just some mental roadblock keeping him from doing what he needs to do. That's something that also resonates with me. I just thought it was like really emotionally gripping and tragic. But then, you know, later on, that scene where he goes back up into the tower, and he's between like a rock and a hard place with Moash at this point, right? But then he's like, no, I'm gonna do what's right. And he goes up there, and that whole sequence, and he calls out to Syl, and he says the words and unlocks the new radiant powers, and it's dope as shit. Like, it's one of the sickest scenes. I was like throwing my arms up reading it like a madman. Like, I looked like a damn retard, like celebrating reading a book, right? Like a damn caveman. You know what I'm saying? Doodle Bob over here, right? It was fantastic. So, like, just the emotional stakes, right? That was fantastic. There were multiple run-ins with Szeth. Of course, you have, like, that first part where Kaladin is throwing hands with Szeth. In, like, the middle of the book, I think it was. And then he runs off, and they were all on edge, and they're, you know, trying to fortify the place and make sure Dalinar and the king is safe and all that. But then it's time for Kaladin to go throw hands, round 2, right? And that whole battle in the sky, and just the war happening with the freaking, not the fused. I guess maybe they're fused at this point. I don't remember, but the Parshendi that are like shooting red lightning everywhere, and man, it just, everything in the Sanderlanche of Words of Radiance is just amazing. The Sanderlanche is fantastic in this novel, but unlike Way of Kings and Oathbringer, I think that everything leading up to, like, basically the whole book is paced well. Even, like, the Sanderlanches are always paced well. They're always dope, right? But I think what happens before matters more, because you can expect the Sanderlanche to be dope. So what matters is what happens before. And, you know, Way of Kings wasn't paced terribly, but it was slow. Oathbringer, it's taken me 8 months to read it, right? But this, it's just paced perfectly, and it's just one of my favorite books ever. So it had to be number 1. Yeah, I love the Stormlight Archive for the most part. And yeah, this is probably my favorite book of all time. So anyways, guys, that's probably going to be about it for today's video. I know this was a little rambling, and it's going to end up being a long video. But yeah, that's sort of kind of my top 10 of the year. Yeah, I'm kind of tired now that I'm done talking. So I'm probably going to go take a nap or eat food or something. because I did a lot of talking just then. This is a long video. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed, and if you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, because I would greatly appreciate it. As always, the links are down in the description. Join the Discord, talk about some books and games and comics, anything cool and nerdy. You can join me there. Instagram, all that stuff down in the description. Go check it out. And yeah, guys, thanks for watching.